Alien princess shocked to discover humans can breed anytime. Her demands for proof, the flagship of the Draken Empire sailed silently through the void of space, its massive form dwarfing even the largest of the nearby asteroids. Aboard this ship, Princess Irida stood at the observation deck, gazing out at the stars. As the heir to the Draken throne, she had spent her life studying the great civilizations of the galaxy, each one more impressive than the last. Yet the humans were different. They were a species unlike anything the Draken had encountered. The human colony on the distant planet of Tethys was a new discovery for the Empire, and Irida had been sent to assess whether the species was a threat or an opportunity. There had been reports of their extraordinary technological capabilities, their ability to survive in hostile environments, and most perplexing of all, their rumored ability to reproduce at will anytime they wished. This last fact had caught Irida's attention like nothing else. For the Draken, reproduction was a highly regulated process, tied to the seasons and requiring precise planning. The idea that a species could simply breed whenever they chose was unfathomable to her. Irida had read the reports, but she needed to see it for herself. As the princess of the Draken, she demanded proof. It was not that she doubted the human claims, but the idea that something as fundamental as reproduction could be so free, so unpredictable, unsettled her. She would meet with the humans and witness this supposed ability firsthand. When the Draken flagship arrived at the human colony, Princess Irida was greeted by a woman who appeared to be in charge. Her name was Captain Alina Reyes, a tall woman with dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 decisions. Despite the formalities of their greeting, Irida could sense Alina's wariness. After all, it wasn't every day that the princess of a galactic empire showed up unannounced, demanding proof of something as personal as reproduction. Irida wasted no time with pleasantries. "I've been told your species has a unique ability," she began, her voice sharp but not unkind. "That humans can breed at any time without the need for seasons or cycles. I need to see proof of this." Captain Reyes blinked, taken aback by the suddenness of the request. The human was undoubtedly confused, but Irida's words left no room for negotiation. Alina nodded after a moment, her expression hardening with resolve. "I'll arrange a demonstration," Alina said, though it was clear she was trying to hide her discomfort. She led Irida to the heart of the human colony, a high-tech facility designed to study human biology. It was equipped with advanced instruments, but it was nothing like the cold, clinical labs that Irida was accustomed to in Draken science. Once inside the lab, Irida's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything that might hint at hidden technology or advanced tools to manipulate biology. There was nothing out of the ordinary. The humans seemed oddly normal. "Please go ahead," Alina said, gesturing to a small group of human scientists who were preparing some sort of biological display. They were taking samples, running tests. None of it looked impressive to Irida. She expected more, something that could demonstrate the supposed miracle of human reproduction. As Alina prepared to begin the demonstration, Irida's curiosity grew. She had expected some sort of technological trickery, but it was becoming clear that there was nothing artificial about this ability. She watched intently as a human scientist explained how human reproduction worked. It was not bound to seasons or cycles as in Draken culture. It was a matter of choice, of biology that allowed humans to reproduce at any time without needing special conditions. Irida frowned. This didn't make sense. Her own species, the Draken, followed strict cycles for reproduction, governed by the seasons. It wasn't just a biological process. It was ceremonial. The act of reproduction was a sacred event, tied to ritual and timing. The idea that humans could breed at any time without ceremony, without preparation, was an affront to everything Irida had been taught. She crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "Are you saying you can reproduce whenever you wish with no preparation at all?" she asked, her voice low, almost disbelieving. "Yes," Alina answered simply, not flinching under the princess's scrutiny. "It's how we've evolved. Humans don't need rituals or special conditions. We reproduce when we decide it's time. That's all there is to it." Irida's mind raced as she processed the information. She had spent so much of her life studying the ways of other species, learning their biology, their rituals, their strengths. But this was different. This was chaotic, uncontrolled. She didn't understand it, and it made her uneasy. The thought that a species could simply choose when to reproduce without any cosmic order was a violation of the very laws of nature that the Draken held sacred. "Can you show me?" Irida demanded, her voice sharp. "Demonstrate it to me." Alina hesitated, but Irida's tone left no room for refusal. She had to see it for herself. Alina looked to the human scientists, who exchanged uneasy glances before one of them stepped forward. "We can explain it, Princess," the scientist said, his voice steady but cautious. "But it's not something that can be easily demonstrated on command. Reproduction is a personal act, and it's not something we usually showcase to strangers." Irida's eyes narrowed. "I don't care about personal acts. I want proof. You claim that humans can breed at any time. Show me how it works, now." The room fell silent. Alina stepped forward, her face a mask of professionalism, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration. She had expected questions, but not this demand. Still, she knew there was no avoiding it. The princess was not going to leave until she had the answers she was seeking. "We'll do what we can," Alina said. She turned to the human scientists and gave them a nod. They began setting up an experiment, preparing data for Irida to see. But even as they worked, Alina could sense the growing tension in the room. Irida's demand was more than just a simple request. It was an assertion of power, an attempt to prove that the Draken were superior, that their way of life, tied to the seasons and rituals, was the only way that mattered. But Alina knew the truth. Humans had adapted. They didn't need to follow the ancient rules. They were free to choose when to breed, free to live their lives without the constraints of ceremony or law. It was a freedom that Irida could not comprehend, and that, Alina realized, was exactly why she had to see it for herself. Princess Irida remained silent as she watched the humans prepare their demonstration. Her mind churned with questions, with confusion. How could this be? How could a species be so free? She had to know more. This was not just a biological curiosity, it was something deeper. Something that threatened to shake the very foundation of her understanding of the universe. Finally, the demonstration began. The humans showed how they were able to engage in reproduction without any external triggers, no seasons, no rituals. It was simply a matter of choice. To Irida, it felt alien, almost unnatural, and yet she couldn't deny that the humans seemed perfectly at ease with it. As the demonstration concluded, Irida stood still, her mind reeling. She had seen the proof, but it only raised more questions. How could something so fundamental be so unstructured? And more importantly, what did this mean for the Draken Empire? Irida turned to Alina, her face unreadable. "This is impossible," she whispered. "How can you live this way without any order?" Alina met her gaze, her voice calm but firm. "We live the way we do because we're human. We don't need rigid rules or cycles. We choose how we live." Irida's heart raced. She had come seeking proof, but what she had found was something far more profound. The humans weren't just a species with strange biology. They were a species that had mastered freedom itself. And that, Irida realized, was something she couldn't easily dismiss. Princess Irida stood in the sterile room, her thoughts swirling in confusion. The humans had shown her their biological processes, their casual approach to reproduction, and she couldn't shake the sense of unease it left her with. The Draken Empire was built on structure, on ritual and order. Every aspect of their civilization, from their technology to their biology, was carefully controlled and designed. The idea that humans could simply choose when to reproduce, without ceremony or any external need, felt utterly foreign to her. The human demonstration had left her with more questions than answers. Irida found herself wondering if this ability was unique to humans, or if there were other species in the galaxy who had also evolved this way. She had spent years studying countless civilizations, but she had never encountered anything like this before. What could it mean? What kind of people, what kind of society could thrive without structure? Could this be a strength, or was it a weakness that would lead to chaos? As she stood in the lab, staring at the scientists who had so casually demonstrated their strange biology, she realized she needed to understand more. She had come to observe, to assess, and now she had to dig deeper. The Draken Empire had no room for weakness or unpredictability. But if humans could truly thrive without these rigid rules, maybe they weren't as primitive as she'd initially thought. Maybe there was something more to them, something she needed to learn. "Princess Irida, are you well?" Captain Alina Reyes asked, her voice breaking through Irida's thoughts. Irida blinked, startled by the question. She hadn't even realized how long she had been standing there, lost in her own mind. Alina was standing a few feet away, watching her carefully. The human leader had been quiet since the demonstration, perhaps trying to gauge what the princess was thinking. "I'm fine," Irida replied, her voice more curt than she intended. She straightened, pushing away the thoughts that had clouded her mind. "Tell me more about your species, about your ways. How is it possible for humans to reproduce so freely with no seasons or external factors controlling it?" Alina hesitated, clearly sensing the shift in the princess's tone. She knew that Irida was no longer just curious. She was trying to understand something much deeper. But Alina didn't know where to begin. The concept of human reproduction was so ingrained in her culture that explaining it felt almost absurd. To her, it was just natural. We don't really think about it like that," Alina said slowly. "It's just part of who we are. Humans reproduce when they're ready, when they choose. There's no set time or season. It's just a part of life." Irida's eyes narrowed. "But what happens if you don't choose, if you don't decide to reproduce? Is it not essential for the survival of your species?" Alina took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. She had always believed that human ways of life were natural, but explaining them to someone like Irida, someone who was so deeply entrenched in her own empire's customs, was proving difficult. "It's not like we're just randomly reproducing all the time," Alina explained. We choose when we're ready. We choose based on emotional connection, mutual respect, and the desire to create life. It's not a process that's forced upon us like it might be for other species. It's something that comes from within. We believe in the power of choice and personal freedom. If two people decide they want to have children, then they can. If they don't, then they don't. It's a natural, personal decision. Irida listened closely, but the more Alina explained, the more perplexed the princess became. She couldn't comprehend this idea of choice. In Draken society, reproduction was far from a personal decision. It was a calculated, almost political event. Reproducing was a duty, a responsibility to the empire and its future. To allow such a personal act to be so uncontrolled, so casual, felt dangerous to Irida. How could a species, a society, function without strict rules governing such an important matter? Alina could see the confusion on Irida's face. She knew the princess was struggling to understand, but she didn't know how to make her see. The human way of life, for all its freedoms, was difficult to explain to someone who had been raised with such a rigid worldview. She felt sympathy for Irida. This was a big shift in thinking, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. "We understand that this concept might be difficult to grasp," Alina said gently. "But we've learned to live with it. Humans are adaptable. We make choices based on what we feel is right for us, and that includes when and how we bring life into the world. It's not about control, it's about freedom, and it works for us." Irida felt a knot form in her stomach. Freedom. The word lingered in her mind, but it wasn't the kind of freedom she understood. In Draken culture, freedom was tied to structure. A well-ordered society was the foundation of their power. Without that order, the empire would crumble. But what if the humans were right? What if their freedom, their ability to make choices without being tied to the seasons or cycles, was the key to their strength? "Is there no consequence for this?" Irida asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "No risk, no chaos?" Alina's face softened. "Of course, there are risks, but we've learned to manage them. We have systems in place to support people who choose to have children. We provide education, health care, and the resources needed to raise a family. It's not a decision that's taken lightly. But it's a decision that's made with love, respect, and the desire to build a better future." Irida's mind was racing. The more Alina spoke, the more Irida felt as if her entire worldview was being turned upside down. She had always believed that control, that structure, was the only way to ensure stability. But here were the humans, living freely, making their own choices, and thriving in a way the Draken Empire never could. Was it possible that their approach was better? Was it possible that the Draken had been wrong all along? Before Irida could voice her next question, a young human scientist entered the room, holding a data pad. "Captain Reyes, we've completed the analysis of the samples," he said, his voice quick and efficient. "The data confirms that the humans are indeed capable of reproducing at any time. No external factors are required. It's all tied to biology, nothing more." Irida turned to look at the scientist, her eyes narrowing. "But why? How is it possible?" The scientist didn't seem to notice the princess's growing frustration. It's just how humans evolved, princess. It's an adaptation. The human body doesn't need the environment to dictate when reproduction happens. It can occur at any time, depending on the individual's readiness and desire. There's no need for specific conditions or timing. Irida felt a rush of emotions, none of which she had the words to express. The more she learned about humans, the more she realized that their way of life was nothing like hers. And yet, they had something that the Draken Empire lacked, a sense of personal freedom, an ability to choose their destiny. They were not bound by the same constraints that governed her people. It was as if they had transcended the very thing that defined the Draken, control. Her thoughts were interrupted by Alina's voice. I know this is a lot to process, princess, but we can show you more. We can explain how our society works, how we balance freedom with responsibility. I know it might seem strange, but it works for us. And it's not just about reproduction. It's about how we live, how we choose to live. Irida took a step back, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had come here to study the humans, to determine if they were a threat or a curiosity. But now, she found herself questioning everything she had believed. Could a species truly thrive without the rigid structure that had governed the Draken for centuries? Was the human way of life, with its freedom and choice, a model for the future, or was it a dangerous path that would eventually lead to chaos? She looked at Alina, her gaze more thoughtful than before. I will need to learn more, Irida said quietly. Much more. Alina nodded. Of course, princess, we're here to help you understand, and we hope that in the end you'll see that we're not so different after all. Irida wasn't sure what she would find, or whether she would ever be able to fully embrace the human way of life. But one thing was certain, her journey had only just begun. And the more she learned about the humans, the more she realized that everything she thought she knew about the galaxy, and her own people, might be wrong. Princess Irida walked through the corridors of the human colony, her mind swirling with the events of the past few days. Since her arrival, she had been immersed in the strange and fascinating world of humanity. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her initial mission had been simple, to observe and assess whether humans posed a threat to the Draken Empire. But now she found herself questioning everything she knew about her own species, her own culture. The more she learned about human biology, the more she realized how different it was from anything the Draken had ever encountered. Reproduction without seasons, without rigid cycles, it was something that made her feel uneasy, yet intrigued at the same time. The Draken had spent centuries perfecting their way of life, a way based on control, order, and predictability. Every action, every decision was tied to a schedule. Reproduction was no exception. But the humans, they seemed to live without these constraints, and it both puzzled and fascinated her. Irida was so deep in thought that she almost didn't notice when Captain Alina Reyes stepped beside her. Alina had become her guide through the human way of life, explaining their customs, their biology, and their philosophies. But even Alina's calm demeanor couldn't entirely erase the tension that had grown between them. Princess, are you feeling all right? Alina asked, her voice gentle. I know this has been a lot to process. Irida paused and looked at Alina, her brow furrowed. She had never encountered a leader so willing to explain, to share such personal aspects of their culture. She had expected the humans to hide their weaknesses, to shield themselves from scrutiny. But instead, Alina had opened up to her, answering her questions with patience, even when the princess had pressed too hard. I'm fine, Irida replied, her voice colder than she intended. But there is still much I do not understand. Alina smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. That's understandable. What we do may seem strange to you, but it's just the way we've always lived. Irida looked away, her gaze drawn to the stars outside the observation window. You say that, but I'm not sure I believe it. The more I learn about you, the more I realize that your way of life is completely different from ours, and that makes it harder for me to understand. Your species, seem to live with no boundaries, no laws to govern your behavior. No cycles to control your actions. Alina's smile faded. We do have boundaries, princess. We may not have strict rituals or cycles like your people, but we still have rules. We just choose to live in a way that allows us to be free. We believe that people should be able to make their own choices, even when it comes to something as important as reproduction. It's not about chaos, it's about the ability to live authentically. Irida turned back to face her, the tension between them palpable. But don't you worry about the consequences. Don't you fear that your lack of control will lead to disorder, to something worse? Elena shook her head. We don't fear it. We believe that freedom brings responsibility. And it's up to each individual to make choices that are right for them, not because they're forced to, but because they want to. It's not chaos, Princess. It's a different kind of order, one based on mutual respect and understanding. Irida let out a slow breath, struggling to process the words. The idea of freedom without boundaries was something she had never considered. Her entire life had been defined by rules, by structure, by the expectations of the Draken Empire. To live without those constraints was unimaginable to her. And yet, as much as she wanted to dismiss it as foolishness, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder if there was something to this idea of freedom. Tell me, Irida said, her voice quieter now. How do humans truly thrive without the need for control? How do you ensure that your species doesn't fall apart without these boundaries? Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. We thrive by helping each other, by supporting each other. We have systems in place, laws that protect our rights, institutions that help provide for our people. But those systems aren't meant to restrict us. They're meant to help us live in harmony. We may not have the rigid structure that your people have, but that doesn't mean we lack order. It just looks different. Irida nodded slowly, processing Elena's words. She had heard the word harmony before, but it had never meant the same thing to her as it did now. The Draken Empire's harmony was built on control. Harmony through obedience, through ritual, through the certainty that everyone knew their place. But the humans, perhaps they had something else, a different kind of harmony. One that allowed for choice, for individuality, and yet still held them together as a species. Your people, they make decisions together? Irida asked, her voice still uncertain. Even when it comes to matters as important as reproduction? Elena nodded. Yes. We don't make decisions in isolation. We make them with the people we trust, the people we care about. It's not about following a set of rules. It's about making sure that we're doing what's best for ourselves and for the future. Irida's mind raced with new questions, each one more difficult than the last. She had been taught that the only way for a species to survive was through control, but the humans seemed to have flourished precisely because they rejected that idea. It was a concept so foreign to her that she struggled to accept it. Yet she couldn't deny the evidence in front of her. The humans were not only surviving, they were thriving. As the conversation continued, Irida began to realize that her mission had changed. She had come here to observe and assess, but now she found herself at a crossroads. She had learned so much about humanity in such a short time, and yet she was only beginning to understand the depth of their way of life. The Draken Empire had always prided itself on its strict control, on its ability to keep everything in balance. But was that truly the key to their success? Was it possible that the rigid structure they relied on was actually a limitation? Could the humans be right? Could freedom, choice, and individuality be the path to true strength? Irida didn't have the answers, but as she looked at Elena, standing beside her, she realized that her views were shifting. She no longer saw the humans as simple creatures to be studied and catalogued. She saw them as something more, something worth learning from. For the first time since her arrival, Irida felt a glimmer of uncertainty. She had always been so sure of the Draken way of life, so certain that their culture was the pinnacle of civilization. But now she wasn't so sure. Elena noticed the change in Irida's demeanor, the shift in her attitude. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough for Elena to recognize that the princess was beginning to see things differently. She had never expected to change Irida's mind, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to understand. Princess, Elena said softly, I know this is hard to understand. I know that everything you've been taught is in conflict with what you're seeing here. But I hope that in time you'll see that we're not so different. We all want the same thing, a future where we can choose our own path, where we can live in harmony, and where we can build something better for those who come after us. Irida turned to her, her expression thoughtful. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of her journey. There was so much more to learn, so much more to understand. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would find a way to reconcile her own beliefs with the new ideas she was encountering. I'm starting to understand, Irida said quietly, but I have a long way to go. Elena smiled, a look of relief crossing her face. We'll be here to help you, Princess. You don't have to do it alone. And as they continued their conversation, walking through the human colony together, Irida realized that she was no longer an outsider here. She was learning. She was growing. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to see that the future wasn't as predictable as she once thought. Princess Irida sat at the large table in the human colony's conference room, her fingers lightly tapping the surface as she tried to focus on the conversation. The discussions around her were about human technology, their advancements, and how they had managed to thrive without the rigid cycles that govern the Draken way of life. But her mind wasn't fully in the room. It hadn't been in the room for days. Ever since that first demonstration of human reproduction, Irida had found herself wrestling with a mix of emotions, disbelief, confusion, and a strange curiosity that she couldn't explain. The humans had shown her that their biological processes were not bound to any seasons or cycles, and that alone had shaken her. But it wasn't just that. It was the freedom they lived by. It was their way of making choices, about reproduction, about family, about everything, without being shackled by tradition or ritual. And that, more than anything, had her questioning everything she had ever known. She glanced at Captain Alina Reyes, who was sitting across from her, engaged in a conversation with one of the human engineers. Alina seemed calm, composed, confident in the way she spoke about her people's achievements. But Irida saw something else in her, the quiet strength of someone who had learned to navigate a world that didn't conform to the same rules of order and control that the Draken held sacred. Irida cleared her throat, breaking her thoughts. Alina looked at her, a slight furrow in her brow. "Princess, is something troubling you?" Alina asked, her voice soft but concerned. Irida met her gaze, and for a moment the weight of her thoughts seemed to press down harder than ever. She had come to this colony with one purpose: to observe, to learn about the humans, and to assess their potential as an ally or a threat to the Draken Empire. But now everything had changed. She wasn't sure what she was anymore, what she believed. Her certainty about the superiority of the Draken way of life was slowly slipping away. "I don't know what to think anymore," Irida admitted quietly. "I've seen things here that don't fit with anything I've known. I've seen how your people live. How you make choices, even about something as important as reproduction. And I can't help but wonder, is this freedom, or is it just a path to chaos?" Alina was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. She had never expected to hear the princess say those words. But as she watched Irida, she realized that this wasn't just about biology. This was about the deeper question that had been haunting Irida since her arrival. Can a society truly survive without control, without rigid boundaries? Alina leaned forward slightly, her tone sincere. "Freedom can be hard to understand if you've never known it. I'm not saying that our way is perfect. There are always challenges, always things we could do better. But the one thing we believe in is that people should be free to make their own decisions. To live their lives the way they see fit, as long as they don't hurt anyone else. That's the foundation of our society." Irida's eyes narrowed. "But what if they make the wrong decision? What if they choose something that leads to disaster?" Alina smiled softly, shaking her head. "That's the risk we take, but we trust each other. We believe that people, when given the freedom to choose, will make the right decisions most of the time. And when they don't, we help them. We learn from our mistakes. It's not chaos, it's life, Princess." "It's messy, but it's real." Irida didn't respond immediately. She was thinking, weighing Alina's words. The concept of choice without fear of consequence was alien to her. In Draken society, the consequences of breaking tradition, of straying from the approved path, were severe. Disobedience was not tolerated, but the humans, they seemed to embrace uncertainty, to face the unknown with an openness that both frightened and fascinated her. "What about reproduction?" Irida asked, her voice softer now. "How do you ensure that children are raised well? That they grow up to be strong, capable citizens of your society?" Alina's smile faded, but she didn't look away. "We have systems in place. It's not perfect, but we do our best to make sure that every child has what they need to grow up healthy and strong. We have education, healthcare, and community support. Families, no matter how they're formed, work together to provide for the next generation." Irida leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. She had expected a more rigid answer, something about laws, rules, and order. But this was something entirely different. It wasn't about control, it was about trust. Trust in people, in society, in the idea that everyone could contribute in their own way. So you don't fear that your society will break apart? Irida asked, almost in disbelief. That it will collapse because there are no strict rules, no unbreakable structure, Alina's gaze softened. I think we fear more the idea of living without choice. Without the ability to make decisions for ourselves, that's what we fear. We fear living a life where we're told exactly what to do, where to go, and how to think. That kind of life, Princess, it might seem safe, but it isn't really living. Irida swallowed hard. She had spent so long thinking that the Draken way was the only way to ensure stability, peace, and progress. She had thought that without order, without rules, everything would fall into chaos. But here, in front of her, was a living example of a species that had made a different choice. A species that lived without the rigid structure that had defined her entire existence. And they were thriving. We're not perfect, Alina continued, her voice steady, but we're learning. We make mistakes, but we grow from them. We learn from each other and we help each other. That's what makes us stronger, not the rules we follow, but the people we trust. That's how we build our future. Irida was silent, staring out of the conference room window at the stars beyond. Her mind was racing. The Draken had never made room for mistakes. They had never allowed their society to evolve in the way that the humans had. The Draken Empire was built on the idea that strength came from control. But here she was, confronted with a species that believed strength came from freedom, from choice, from trust. She felt something inside her shift, a small crack in the foundation of her beliefs. Could it be true? Could it be that the Draken way of life, so perfect, so ordered, so unyielding, was not the only path to survival? What if the humans were right? What if their way was the future? The thought both terrified and intrigued her. I don't know what to believe anymore, Irida confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I had all the answers, but now I'm not sure. Alina's eyes softened. It's okay to feel that way, Princess. Change is hard, but it's also necessary. We can't stay the same forever. If we do, we stop growing, we stop living. Irida nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. She wasn't sure what the future held for her or for the Draken Empire. But one thing was certain, the journey she had started was far from over. And the answers she sought would not come easily. She had come here to study the humans, but now she realized that she was studying herself. Her beliefs, her culture, her way of life, all of it was being called into question. And though she didn't know what she would find in the end, she knew that her path was no longer clear. The choice was hers to make. And it was a choice she would have to face, no matter the cost. Princess Irida stood at the edge of the human colony's observation deck, staring out at the endless stars. The vastness of space stretched before her, a sea of lights and darkness, each one a reminder of how small and insignificant any one species might seem in the grand scheme of the universe. Yet, for all the enormity of it, she had never felt more uncertain about the future. The past few days had been a whirlwind of revelations. Her mind, once so certain about the superiority of Draken culture and its rigid structure, was now filled with doubts. She had come here to study the humans, to observe their biology, their ways, and to understand how they could possibly survive without the strict rules and rituals that governed her people. But now, after seeing their way of life firsthand, everything had changed. It wasn't just the way they reproduced, free from the cycles and laws that controlled Draken biology. It wasn't just the freedom they had in every aspect of their lives, their ability to make choices without being confined by tradition. No, it was something deeper. Something more profound. The humans lived with trust. They trusted each other, they trusted their ability to make decisions, and they trusted that the system they had built, despite its flaws, would help them grow stronger. It was a trust that the Draken Empire had long ago abandoned. Irida had come to admire that trust, to wonder if it was the key to the strength the humans had found, the reason they had thrived in ways the Draken had never considered. She had never imagined that freedom could be a source of strength. In her world, freedom was dangerous, and control was the only path to survival. But the humans, how was it that they had found a way to thrive without control? She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Captain Alina Reyes approaching. Alina had been her guide and her teacher in this strange new world. She had answered every question, offered insight when Irida needed it most, and yet there was something unspoken between them now. The princess could see that Alina was watching her closely, as though waiting for her to make a decision. Alina stopped a few feet away from Irida, giving her space but not retreating. The silence between them was heavy. Irida could feel the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her. "I've been thinking," Irida finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "About everything I've seen here, about your people, your way of life. I've been trying to understand it. I've tried to apply the logic of the Draken way to it, but nothing fits. I don't know if I can." Alina's gaze softened. "It's not an easy thing to understand, Princess. It's hard to break free from what we're taught, from what we're raised to believe. But the truth is, freedom is messy. It's not always neat and controlled, but it's ours, and that's what makes it worth it." Irida turned to face Alina fully, her expression serious. "And yet, you don't fear what might happen. You don't fear that it will all collapse, that your freedom, your choices will lead to chaos." Alina smiled, though it was a sad smile. "We fear it, yes. We know that things can go wrong. We've seen it happen. But we don't let fear control us. We learn from our mistakes and we try again. We don't give up on each other just because we're afraid of the unknown." Irida's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. Alina's words echoed in her ears, and she found herself wondering about the very core of her beliefs. The Draken Empire had been built on the idea that strength came from control. That if they could master everything, from their biology to their culture, they could protect themselves and ensure their future. The Draken had kept their empire stable for centuries. But at what cost? "Are we so different then?" Irida asked quietly. "The Draken and humans." Alina looked at her, her eyes reflecting a depth of understanding. "Yes, but we're not as different as you might think. You believe in control, we believe in freedom, but both are about survival. You see the world as something to be ruled. We see it as something to be shared. You fight to maintain order, we fight to maintain trust. It's different, but it's not weak." Irida's heart beat faster as she listened. She had never thought of her people's way as something to be feared. She had always believed that the Draken way was the right way, the only way. And yet now, for the first time, she was seeing the cracks in that belief. What had the Draken built their empire on? Was it really strength, or was it just fear? Fear of the unknown. Fear of what might happen if they let go of control. And now, here was Alina standing in front of her, a living example of what freedom could look like. Irida wasn't sure if she was ready to embrace that freedom, or if she ever would be. But she knew one thing. The journey she had started on was not just about the humans. It was about her, too. About learning whether the Draken way was the only way, or whether there was more to the universe than she had been taught. "I don't know if I can ever fully accept your way of life," Irida admitted, her voice hesitant. "I don't know if I can leave behind everything I've been taught, everything I've believed in." Alina nodded, understanding. "It's not something you can change overnight. It's a process. You don't have to accept everything at once, but I hope you'll keep thinking about it, keep asking questions. It's the only way to grow." Irida looked at her for a long moment, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She had never thought of herself as someone who needed to grow. As the princess of the Draken, she had always been in control, always certain. But now she felt like a stranger in her own skin. "I've always believed that strength comes from control," Irida said slowly. "From knowing exactly what will happen, when it will happen, and how it will happen. But now I'm not so sure. The more I learn about you and your people, the more I wonder if we've been wrong all along." Alina didn't say anything right away, but her eyes shone with a quiet pride. "It's okay to question, Princess. It's okay to not have all the answers. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting that you don't know everything, from being open to change, to seeing that there might be another way." Irida felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, she wasn't just questioning her beliefs. She was beginning to think about what it would mean to change them. What it would mean to leave behind the old ways, to embrace something new, something unknown. "You've given me a lot to think about," Irida said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know where this journey will take me, but I can't ignore what I've learned here. I can't unsee the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there's another way." Alina smiled, her gaze full of understanding. "That's all anyone can ask for, Princess. To keep searching, to keep growing, to keep learning. And one day you'll find the path that's right for you." Irida nodded slowly, her eyes turning once again to the stars. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know where her path would take her. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the same person who had arrived on this colony days ago. She had learned something important, something that would shape her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The Draken Empire had built its power on control. But maybe, just maybe, there was another kind of power, a power born from trust, from choice, from freedom. It was a power that Irida was only beginning to understand, and the journey toward it had only just begun.